Welcome to our symposium for 2022. In this annual event, we provide an opportunity for you to hear from leaders in our field about issues that are important to the work we do and to clinical and prevention practitioners. This year's no exception. Through decades of research, we know that children from impoverished backgrounds tend to lag behind their more advantaged peers in their cognitive development. In this year's symposium, we will hear from Dr. Kim Noble of Columbia University, who is investigating ways to protect children from the effects of poverty on their developing brains. To lead the discussion with her, we are fortunate to have Dr. Nia Hurd-Garris, a practicing pediatrician and researcher at Northwestern University and also at Children's Hospital of Chicago. Her research interests revolve around the relationship between adversities experienced earlier in life and later health, so her training and practice makes her an ideal person to lead today's discussion. And now, here is Dr. Hurd-Garris.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Dr. Brody. I think we are in for such a fascinating discussion today. Kim Noble is a fellow pediatrician and a neuroscientist with both an MD and PhD, and is a professor of neuroscience and education at Teachers College at Columbia University in New York City. With funding from NIH and numerous foundations, her team studies how socioeconomic inequity relates to children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development. And as we talk today, you may ask a question at any time in the comments on YouTube or through your email. We may address the question then or at the end of our time together. So with the audience, I'd like to warmly welcome Dr. Noble.
Thank you so
Hi,
much.
Dr. Noble. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're so excited to dig in and talk to you about all of your work and all of the things that you and your team have accomplished together. But before we do that, I want to get to know a little bit more about you. Is that okay?
Of course.
Well, I am really fascinated. So I'm a researcher too, as you know, but I did not take the plunge and get an MD and PhD, although I have some regret about it. I want to know from you, why did you decide to do both degrees, especially for students out there that are really interested in these dual career paths? Why did you do it?
Sure. So I was perhaps unusual in that I knew I wanted to be a psychology professor from very early on. So I started college with that idea. I ended up majoring in a major that at the time was called the biological basis of behavior, that subsequently got changed to neuroscience. I had a lot of pre-med students in my classes, and I have to admit, I kind of gave them a little side eye. It was not my intended track at all. I really thought I was going to go the straight PhD route. And then when I was an undergraduate at Penn, I did some work in a neurology lab led by Dr. Murray Grossman. So with him, I did a project looking at reading ability among dementia patients. And he asked me if I would be interested in starting to shadow him, not just in the lab, but in his neurology clinic when he actually saw patients. So I said, okay. And then it turned out I actually really liked it. So I felt a little bit guilty about all the side I had given those pre-med students. So I spent a long time thinking about it and then ultimately decided to pursue a combined degree program.
That's amazing. Do you have any advice for people that are kind of not sure, like they know they are interested in research or they know they want to do something with the brain and aren't sure if they want to be physicians and PhDs, or what do you tell those people?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the research side of things, it's so important to get lab experience, right? I mean, so I think casting a wide net, in many cases, people are very eager to have students who, express enthusiasm and are willing to dedicate some of their time to the lab. And so the more time that you can spend doing that, the better, as an undergraduate or as a post-bac, to really get that research experience and to prepare you for graduate school. In terms of medical school, in some ways, the same thing applies. So getting some experience shadowing someone clinically, actually seeing patients with them. Of course, in the time of COVID, that could be a little bit more complicated than in times past, although it seems like we're moving toward a place where that's going to be possible again soon.
Yeah, fingers and toes both crossed. I think that it's really important for us to know that there are many different career paths to getting to where, we are today. And a lot of us don't always share that path. So I'm really happy that you were able to do that for us. It seems like some of your earlier experiences may have helped to shape why you're doing what you're doing today. I'd love to know like how you got interested really in the role of poverty and how that shapes the brain and brain development. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would love to. As an undergraduate, I got very interested in child development from an academic perspective. Was focused really on reading development and cognitive development. That was sort of the area I thought I would go in. And then extracurricularly, I had spent a lot of time working with underserved populations. I was part of a children's theater troupe that brought theater to underserved elementary schools in West Philadelphia. I had done some tutoring of young kids. And so up to that point, these sort of two facets really remained somewhat separate for me. But I was extremely fortunate when Dr. Martha Farah, who I met as an undergraduate and then subsequently worked with in graduate school, asked me if I'd be willing or interested to be her first PhD student to begin to focus on how poverty shapes children's development. So prior to that point, Martha had spent most of her career studying sort of basic visual cognition, things like why do we view faces or perceive faces differently from other objects. And she was interested in sort of changing her research focus to bring it toward more real world examples of cognitive neuroscience. And she asked me to join her on that journey. And so I was really incredibly fortunate to be able to combine those two sets of interests, academic and community oriented, in one pursuit.
That's awesome. It sounds like you've had people kind of along the way that have shuttled you. What about neurology lab? What about, cognition and thinking about that? So it's like people that along your path have helped to open doors or helped to expose you to things that maybe you didn't think you were so interested in. So I love that kind of evolution of how the great Dr. Noble came to be. This is awesome.
I don't know about that, but absolutely, mentorship is so important, really, at each stage of your career. Right, it's obvious when you're, a student or a more junior scholar, but even as you, rise in the ranks toward more senior scholarship, I think having a mentor available or multiple mentors available to support you in different aspects of your professional life is so important. And I've been so incredibly grateful and fortunate to have the mentors I've had.
That's wonderful. May we all be so lucky. I'd love to know a little bit more about some of your earlier work and what that showed in terms of how family income relates to children's brain structure. Can you talk me through some of that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So the very early work linked socioeconomic factors like parents' education or family income to children's cognitive development. So looking at things like language, executive function, memory skills, where the results were pretty consistent across the several different socioeconomically diverse cohorts of kids ranging in age from kindergarten on up through adolescence. We tended to find socioeconomic inequities associated with language skills, as well as more modest but consistent differences in executive function and learning and memory. So taking that a step further to looking at brain structure, so this is work from a study that we published in 2015 using data from the Pediatric Imaging Neurocognition and Genetics, or PING data set, which at the time had done something really quite unprecedented. So prior to the PING study, there were small scale studies of children's brain structure linked to different aspects of socioeconomic circumstances. But this was really the first large-scale such study. So the PING study recruited more than 1,000 children and adolescents from socioeconomically diverse families from around the United States. And the initial point of the PING study, aims of the PING study, really centered on trying to understand typical age-related brain structural development. So how do how does brain structure vary from early childhood on through adolescence? And we were able to take advantage of this large and at the time unprecedented data collection effort to ask secondarily, to what extent do family socioeconomic characteristics, so parent education and family income, relate to the structure of their children's brains? And so to orient you to this slide, this represents the average of the 1,000+ children and teens who were in the study. The left side of your screen, so this is a view of the side of the brain. So the left side is the front of the brain, towards the right is the back of the brain, and the leftmost figure is showing you the side or lateral view. The rightmost figure is showing you a view called the medial view, or straight down the middle. And every point you see in color is a point where, on average, children from higher income homes tended to have a larger surface area or size of the nooks and crannies of the outer surface of the brain, the cerebral cortex, which is the part that we know is responsible for most of our higher order cognitive skills. And so what we found was that across nearly the entire surface of the brain, you see this relationship between income and children's brain structure. And this, moreover, this relationship was particularly pronounced in certain areas shown in yellow that are known to support skills like language and certain aspects of executive functioning. So the brain structural data really recapitulated what we had seen behaviorally. And then there were a couple important points to note here. So first of all, the link between family income and children's brain structure wasn't linear, meaning that dollar for dollar, we saw proportionately greater differences in brain structure among children from the lowest income homes. And intuitively, that makes some sense, right? If you were to give a family earning $100,000 a year another $10,000 a year, that would certainly be nice, but probably wouldn't make a dramatic difference in their day-to-day lives. Whereas if you were to give a family only earning $20,000 a year an extra $10,000 a year, that would probably make a pretty remarkable difference in their day-to-day lives. And the second point, this one is key. If you remember one thing from today's conversation, it should be this. There were tremendous individual differences, right? So plenty of children from higher income homes with smaller brain surfaces, plenty of children from lower income homes with larger brain surfaces. So in no way could I know a particular child's family income and predict with any accuracy what that particular child's brain would look like.
That is really fascinating. I'm just thinking, I have so many questions for you about that study in particular. One of the questions I have is thinking about, at what point were you able to see that there were some diminishing returns with respect to income? Did you see, I think I've read sort of anecdotally, once a family reaches like $70,000 or $80,000, happiness declines. But did you find a similar like cut point or income point that you didn't see a big difference?
So we didn't analyze the data in terms of an actual cut point, but visually, that logarithmic association between income and brain structure in children, we really saw the strongest relationship at about $25,000 and below. So really suggesting that families living at or near poverty would potentially show the greatest differences in children's brain structure as a function of an economic boost.
And did anything about this study surprise you at all? Or did it kind of confirm what you and the team had already hypothesized and really thought to be true?
Well, to some extent, it surprised us how widespread the association was between income and brain structure, right? It wasn't limited to one structure or one neural circuit. We really saw it across nearly the entire cortex. And it was really quite robust. So yes, we had a large sample, but even adjusting for the fact that we were essentially looking at statistically many different tests, because we were checking that association at each point on the brain surface, we still saw that this association was really quite robust to what we call adjustment for multiple comparisons. So a strong and robust and widespread association.
Wow. Okay. So can you tell us what are some possible mechanisms that might link income to brain and behavioral development? Like, what is that pathway?
Sure. So there are certainly many pathways, right? And we're really only just beginning to scratch the surface of what all of those pathways might be. One could hypothesize differences in access to healthy foods or high quality medical care, or perhaps exposure to environmental toxicants like secondhand smoke or lead. All of those are likely parts of the pathway linking socioeconomic experience to children's brain and behavioral outcomes. In my lab, we've been particularly interested in a few different types of experience that we've tried to take a deeper dive on. So one is something known as the home language environment, which is, the idea that kids vary very much in terms of the number of words they hear and the number of conversations they're engaged in the home. And there's some work to suggest particularly that latter value, the number of conversations, back and forth, responsive verbal interactions, really matters over and above the sheer amount of speech that they might hear in the background. So a few years ago, I had a postdoc, Dr. Emily Mers, who's now an assistant professor at Colorado State University, who wanted to explore this question in relation to brain development. And so we had a group of 5 to 9-year-old children who we recruited into the lab. And these were kids who came from quite diverse backgrounds from around the New York City area. And we sent them home with a small recording device called the LENA, which stands for Language Environment Analysis. And it's essentially a small digital recorder that the child can wear for up to 16 hours that automatically records and sort of tells us about the number of adult words the child hears, the number of vocalizations the child makes, and the number of back and forth conversational turns that they're engaged in over the course of that 16-hour period. So we can actually map out the home language environment over the course of that time. And so what Emily found was that children who experienced more conversational turns each hour tended to have a larger surface area in that region there shown in yellow that we call the parasylvian cortex, which is a part of the brain that is heavily supportive of language skill. And so we reasoned that perhaps these socioeconomic disparities that have been described in language skill might be accounted for by these differences in experience and these differences in the brain. And indeed, that's what we found. So one potential pathway, at least for that language-related brain region, may be that children who experience more conversation tend to develop a larger surface area in that language-supporting brain region.
Wow. So is there a take-home message in there for parents, especially parents that are from lower socioeconomic groups? That we should be telling everybody and shouting from the rooftops?
Yeah, so we definitely, as pediatricians, we try to really encourage not just talking to, but talking with your children, right? So conversation is free. And so we can engage our children in conversations in a way that we know is legitimately brain building and language building. So absolutely, certainly the Reach Out and Read program and its offshoots have been wonderful in teaching parents not only about the importance of books and reading with your children, but engaging with your children with books. So, asking them questions, what do they think is going to happen next, relating the story to children's lives to really bring about that richer language experience around the book.
Yeah, beautifully said. Because even in our practice, there are parents that struggle with literacy issues, right? And so if we just encourage them to make up a story, to talk to their kids, even with the book. So I think that's fantastic and obviously very evidence-based recommendation there. From the research side, I'm really fascinated because throughout your work, you've been able to recruit a diverse community, specifically socioeconomic groups, but also beyond that, especially in times now, but certainly times before, it was extremely difficult to recruit these groups. How do you go about thinking about your studies with respect to recruitment and finding people where they are and attracting them, especially if they're working multiple jobs? How do you get them to engage in a study and make it worth their while?
It's so hard and it's so important. I'm so glad that you've asked about that, Nia. So, meeting families where they are is such an important part of it, right? It really, would neither be the message that we would want to send, nor would it be particularly effective for us to sort of float down from our ivory tower and, explain in sciencese what it is that we're doing. And so, for one thing, we try to engage members of the community in our research lab as staff members, right? So, trying to hire research assistants, lab coordinators who come from the local community. In our case, in Columbia, where we're situated, we're pretty close to Harlem and Washington Heights. So hiring, for example, when we recruit from the hospital in the Washington Heights area, hiring research staff who are Dominican American, bilingual Spanish, English speakers who can relate and engage with the potential research participants, not just as research staff members, but as a member of their local community, right? We've found it really goes quite a long way in potentially putting families at ease.
Ooh, I love that. That is great advice, especially as we, throughout the country are thinking more about diversity and equity and inclusion, and how do we include, communities and populations that have been historically marginalized. And so right there, even including folks from different backgrounds in your lab, you're making way for not only them, but the work to happen in communities that you care about. So I think that's amazing advice. I'd like to transition a little bit to babies' first years. This phenomenal study that you're one of the principal investigators on. And it's for those that don't know, it's a large interdisciplinary clinical trial of poverty reduction. Like, I think probably first of its kind, only of its kind. Kim, you'll have to tell me more. But I'd love for our listeners who are just hearing about it for their first time, to describe the study a little bit, and then talk about the planning of a study of this magnitude. Like, what does it take to plan something this big? And then in general, your motivation. But I can come back to some of those questions. So just describe the study for us, and how do you plan such a big study like this?
Well, it has been a long time coming. You can probably see the gray hairs that have started as a result. We began planning baby's first years almost 10 years ago now.
Wow.
I know my oldest child was born shortly before we started planning it, and she'll turn 10 in just a few months. So it's wild. So Baby's First Years, or BFY, is a large multidisciplinary effort across numerous disciplines. So we've got economics, social policy, psychology, and neuroscience represented among our principal investigator team. And so what is it? So in many ways, it's actually very straightforward. So built on this decades-long body of research suggesting that growing up in poverty puts children at risk for a host of negative outcomes, we said, okay, well, there's a lot of research suggesting that clearly. And then more recently, neuroscientists have gotten into the fray and linked poverty or family income differences with children's brain development. But we didn't have the causal evidence, right? We couldn't say poverty is causing those differences in children's brain structure, for example. And there are plenty of people who would say, well, sure, there's an association, but poverty is not causing those differences. Poverty is just associated with those differences. It's really all of the other things associated with poverty that are actually causing those differences. Or someone might even say, it's not poverty, it's parents' choices that are leading to differences in children's outcomes. And regardless of where you sit ideologically on that question, the best way to really address that from a scientific perspective is through a randomized controlled trial design. And so that's the genesis of the Baby's First Year study, which is the first clinical trial of poverty reduction in early childhood in the United States. So what did we actually do? Back in the spring of 2018, we began recruiting 1,000 mothers living with low income shortly after they gave birth in a number of hospitals around the United States. And upon enrolling in the study, mothers were invited to receive a monthly unconditional cash gift that they would be free to spend however they would like, no strings attached. But critically, the mothers were randomized into one of two groups. So the moms in what we term the high cash gift group are receiving $333 a month, and the moms in the low cash gift group are receiving $20 a month. And we chose those amounts very intentionally. So that difference of approximately $4,000 a year has been associated in the social science literature with improvements in a number of different outcomes relevant for kids. So higher school achievement scores, better health in adulthood, higher likelihood of employment in adulthood. And notably, it was also an amount that we thought carried some policy relevance. So, back when we began planning the study 10 years ago, certainly we had no idea that the American Rescue Plan or Build Back Better would be on the horizon. But we did reason that $4,000 a year is an amount similar in size to other social services and benefits that mothers living with low income were likely to qualify for. So it was both an amount that we thought was likely to move the needle and one that would hold some policy relevance for policymakers and other stakeholders. So when they enrolled in the study, moms got a debit card that came preloaded with that month's gift. It automatically reloads every month on the day of the child's birthday. And we've been following up with the families annually to be able to measure the impact of that monthly economic support on child development and family life in the first years of life.
I mean, it's like, I'm almost speechless because that's amazing, right? Like, you all are and were ahead of your time in thinking about giving families money to allow them to decide what to do. Because typically the money is given already, like through a food, right? Food benefit or housing benefit. And so really you were asking families to decide what to do with that money. What was the motivation behind that? Was there a lot of heated debates of how we would give that, how do you give that gift and what they would do with it? Like, I would wish I could be a fly on the wall in those conversations. How did you guys decide that?
Yeah, we get asked that all the time. How are families spending the money? Are you worried they're going to squander it? So the background social science literature really suggests that families living with low income are likely to spend an economic boost in much the same way that families with higher income would spend it. So there's really not evidence existing in the literature to support that stereotype or that trope of families wasting money. And so, from a scientific perspective, to really address the question as to whether poverty or poverty reduction would have a causal impact, it was really important to make the gift unconditional, right? So not conditioned on a certain behavior, not no requirements in terms of how it's spent. And, the beauty in many ways of cash is that it is so flexible, right? And so it is quite possible that the way it affects one family may be very different from the way it affects a different family. And so, we're trying to measure pathways as we go through the study, but ultimately, cash empowers families to use the money how they see fit for their family. And so our ultimate outcomes of interest really center on the children.
That's amazing. I think people are just now starting to realize that, families are in the best position to decide how they need to use the money and not necessarily anyone else. So again, super ahead of your time. I wonder too, like how you thought about the different groups. So the group that got the $300 gift as compared to the $20 gift. Did you have to do extensive work to make sure that they didn't overlap, they weren't in the same networks or environment? Like, how did you make sure that they were separate? And
No, it's a good question. No, so we recruited families in the mothers in the postpartum ward shortly after they gave birth. So they had given birth a day or two before, they were still in the hospital, and we invited them to participate in this study. So we recruited them from, I think it was 12 hospitals in 4 metro areas around the United States. So no particular reason that the mother might know, the mother 2 doors down from her in the hospital, but it is certainly possible. We have anecdotally heard some stories of some of the mothers, later either knowing each other or meeting each other, but we didn't make any particular effort to ensure that they didn't.
Got it. And were there any like concerns or worries either from the families or the study team that they would lose eligibility for other social services or benefits as a result of getting the cash gifts?
No, part of the reason it took so long had to launch the study had to do with that very issue. So I mentioned that we began planning the study in 2012, but we didn't launch till 2018. Now, obviously, part of that was fundraising, but a very big part of that was dealing with exactly that issue known as clawback. And so that's the idea that, if you were to give economic support to a family, that money may render them ineligible for other social services and benefits that they might otherwise qualify for, like SNAP or WIC or what have you. And obviously, that would be ethically terrible if people were to lose their benefits as a result of participating in the study. It would also be a scientifically very unfortunate design if you had these two groups, but the group that got more money was also losing more benefits. So we worked very hard to ensure that that didn't happen. And when I say we, that is very much the royal we. So this is work that was led by two of my incredible social science colleagues, Dr. Catherine Magnuson, who's the director of the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Dr. Lisa Janetian, who's an economist at Duke's Sanford School of Public Policy. And so Catherine and Lisa worked really hard to lead this effort to ensure that moms wouldn't lose their social services or benefits to the extent possible before we recruited the very first mom. And so what that meant practically was that in 2 of the 4 cities where we recruited, they essentially got waivers agency by agency. And in the other 2 states, we actually got state legislation passed saying that for these moms in this study, this money won't count toward their eligibility. So quite a mountain.
Oh my goodness. Wow. You have to get bills passed for the study to go forward. Wow. You also mentioned fundraising. Can you talk a little bit about that and what it takes to be able to give all of those families either $300 or $20? That's a lot of money over the course, of their child's early life. So can you talk about what of a Herculean effort I imagine that was to get that going?
Yes. So to date, we've given out more than $5 million into the pockets of the moms in our study, and we're still going strong. So we're in the middle of the age 3 wave of data collection, and we've currently got funding secured through at least a little bit past when the children turn 4. So it was quite an effort. So one thing to note is that none of the cash gifts themselves are from taxpayer dollars, right? So the federal government is through NIH supporting some of the research and evaluation, but they were very clear we can't, have the research federally funded money be going toward the cash gifts. So all of that is entirely funded through private philanthropy and foundations. So all told, we have about 24 private foundations and philanthropists who have generously donated their resources to the study.
Unreal. And so when you entered your career in science, did you think you would also be a fund expert in raising?
No, definitely not. That has been a wild ride. It's interesting. I had heard the saying before that money begets money, and I in my limited experience, that has shown to be true. I think when you get some funders signed on, then other funders sort of want to join that bandwagon, and we're incredibly grateful for their support.
That's fantastic. So let's go back to the study, and just can you tell me, how you think these economic resources are likely to change the family's lives? So either things that you have seen or they've told you. I don't know if there's qualitative work happening around this too, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So starting out, we hypothesized 2 main pathways via which we expected that the cash might affect families. So the first we call the increased investment pathway. And that's the idea that with greater economic resources, moms are more likely to be able to afford things like books and toys, perhaps higher quality childcare, maybe better housing or safer neighborhoods. And the other is a pathway we call the reduced stress pathway. And that's the idea that if moms are less worried about how they're going to keep the lights on or make that monthly rent check, that they're more likely to be able to engage with their children in the kinds of warm and sensitive ways that we know are so important for children's development. So as we go through the study, we're carefully measuring the aspects of those pathways. But again, what $333 might buy for one family might be very different from what it buys for another. So one family might, buy more books and toys. Another family might choose to work a bit less to be able to spend more time at home. And another family might say, we're going to move to a different apartment where, we have some more space. And so we're measuring different aspects of family life and experience to try to get a handle on what might be going on. But it is quite plausible that those particular pathways may vary so much because of the flexibility of money that it may be somewhat difficult to really disambiguate, and ultimately it may not matter in the sense that different pathways may lead to aspects of child development through multiple different routes.
Yeah, some of the study strikes me as similar to the Moving to Opportunity study, but obviously very different. Has the study been compared to Moving to Opportunity study in the past? And what's kind of your retort or explanation about like how this study is different?
Sure. Actually, one of my co-authors, Lisa Janetti, and who I mentioned before, was involved in the Moving to Opportunity study too. So very briefly, Moving to Opportunities was a randomized control trial where people were presented with the ability to participate in a lottery where they would either be assigned to live in housing in a different, more wealthier neighborhood versus I believe the same neighborhood where they were previously. And so the idea was that these neighborhood resources might serve as a boost to different aspects of child development and family life. And the early results didn't show much difference, but then more recent analyses have suggested that indeed the neighborhood difference did lead to differences ultimately in social mobility. And so I think there are a lot of parallels there in the sense that we're randomizing families to receive different levels of economic support. Of course, in our case, the support is unconditional in terms of what it can be spent on. And so it's different than limiting it to housing vouchers per se, that obviously have one very unique purpose.
Absolutely. So you've been planning the study for 10 years. It's ongoing right now. But the first paper from the study just came out a month ago, right?
Yeah.
And that paper is measuring the impact of the cash gifts on brain activity. Before we get to the results so that our viewers fully understand, can you talk about what actually is brain activity and how do you even measure that?
Well, of course, yes. So great question. So we measure brain activity using a methodology called electroencephalography, or EEG, which you can see here. It basically involves a stretchy cap of discs that we call electrodes that fit comfortably on the child's head. They can sit on their caretaker's lap. Most kids tolerate it really well. It's safe, it's fast, it's pretty simple to use. Unlike MRI that I showed you before, which requires lying perfectly still in a dark and noisy tube, EEG is much more forgiving. Now, you may well be familiar with EEG as a method to measuring seizure activity, but it turns out EEG can actually tell us a lot more than that. So we use the EEG to measure the electrical activity of the brain. You can think of those electrodes sort of like microphones that listen to the electrical activity. Now, of course, we're not mind readers. We don't know what a child's thinking, but we're able to measure the speed of that electrical activity. And so it turns out all kids, all people really, have some fast-paced or high-frequency brain activity and some slower-paced or low-frequency brain activity. So you can sort of see from very fast to slower brain activity there on that slide. And we care about that because as kids grow and develop, they tend to show more fast-paced brain activity and less slow-paced brain activity. So that's just part of typical development. And we also know that unfortunately, kids who are at risk for learning or attention problems often tend to show less fast-paced activity and more slow-paced activity compared to their same age peers. And finally, we also know that from other work that has suggested that in many cases, kids living in poverty or facing other forms of early adversity also tend to show less fast-paced and more slow-paced brain activity compared to their more advantaged peers. And so as a result, we hypothesized that perhaps these cash gifts would reverse this pattern. So specifically, we hypothesized and pre-registered that the infants of the moms in the high cash gift group would show more fast-paced brain activity and less slow-paced brain activity compared to the infants of the moms in the low cash gift group. And so this first paper that came out just about a month ago reported those results after the first year of monthly cash gifts. So these were infants who had were right around their first birthday, and we measured the infant's brain activity. And we did this by traveling into their homes with our EEG setup. So that's a bit unusual. Most EEG research takes place in the well-controlled conditions of our university labs. But, we reasoned that it would be potentially difficult to get mothers with very young children to travel into our labs. So we went to them instead. This was work led by my incredible postdoctoral scholar in my lab, Dr. Sonia Troller-Renfrey, who spearheaded a really unprecedented data collection effort where we brought our EEG caps into the homes. Speaking about sort of culturally sensitive research collection practices, right? We worked very hard to come up with sort of videos and explainers about what EEG is, why we care about it, to make it not seem scary, to make it a comfortable experience for families. And very happy to say the vast majority of families agreed to try it, 95%. In those in-person visits, we had 84% of the babies who were able to successfully be capped, and that resulted in high quality usable data in 72% of that in-person sample. So really we achieved rates of data collection that were around what we would have expected in the lab, which was wonderful. Now, if anyone's doing fast math, you might be thinking 72% of 1,000 is not 435. So what's going on with that? Well, turns out. So we were about 2/3 of the way through our age 1 home visits when the pandemic struck. So unfortunately, mid-March of 2020, we were no longer able to travel into the homes of the families. Now, our team did an amazing job pivoting. I think our last home visit was on a Friday, and by Monday, we were instead collecting data by phone from the families. Mm-hmm. So overall, at the age 1 wave of data collection, we had about 93-94% retention over the whole sample. But that was limited to the information that we could collect by phone. Of course, we can't put a cap on a baby's head over the phone. So unfortunately, our age 1 brain activity measure is limited to the 435 kids who we were able to successfully record brain data from before the pandemic started. And so that unfortunately meant that we had a lot less what we call statistical power, or sort of the ability to measure differences between groups, than we would have liked.
Wow, talk about meeting patients where they are and participants where they are, which is what we were talking about earlier, and resilience of science teams and the adaptability and flexibility, creativity. That's phenomenal. One of my questions about brain activity is there some sort of wisdom around the fast activity and the slower paced activity as to why we see the discrepancies we do for kids that have ADHD or learning disabilities or other troubles in that vein? Like, is there a reason for that with respect to brain activity?
I think we're really at the infancy, no pun intended, of the field and trying to understand what it is that's actually going on under the hood. So right now we have a few small studies suggesting that, this brain pattern is associated with subsequent differences in cognition and behavior, but we're a little bit away from really understanding the why of that phenomenon.
Thank you. I think we have a question for our audience that is quite interesting. So this question is from Miriam. It says, hello, in your research, was there any difference in the impact of increasing parent-child conversation on the brain between bilingual children and monolingual children? Thank you.
That's a great question. So we have not directly done work promoting a parent-child intervention, right? Promoting conversation. So we've done work linking parent-child speech to differences in outcomes, but we haven't directly conducted an intervention aimed at changing parent-child speech and then measuring outcomes. But there are others who have done that. So for example, Dana Suskind at the University of Chicago runs a center called the TMW Center there that has done a number of studies looking at exactly that. Similarly, Anne Fernald at Stanford has done some work specifically focusing on parent-child speech among bilingual and monolingual children. I am not aware of a study that addresses exactly what you're asking, whether an intervention aimed at increasing parent-child conversation differentially changes the brains of bilingual versus monolingual children. That said, there is certainly some evidence to suggest that bilingual and monolingual children have different brain characteristics about language-related structure and language functioning.
Yeah, and I'm just remembering too, as a clinician, how, earlier in pediatrics, we were concerned about developmental delays and speech and language delays in the houses of those that spoke more than one language. And we're coming to know that that's not true, and how monolingual and multilingual children have actually very interesting, development, and they're not behind because they speak more than one language. And so I think more research in that area would be phenomenal, especially for very diverse communities and immigrant communities that are coming to the US. So I think hopefully somebody will do that study. Maybe somebody out there in the audience will do that study.
I totally
I'd love,
agree,
yeah.
If you imagine testing someone who speaks two languages and you're only measuring them in one language, it makes some sense that they may know fewer words in that language compared to someone who only speaks that language. But when you compile across both languages, you tend to see, if anything, more vocabulary among bilingual children. And so, certainly when I was a practicing pediatrician, I would tell patients and their families routinely, please, speak to your children in your native language. There's really no benefit and potentially harm from trying to speak in a language that you're not as comfortable in. They will learn English at school. You do not have to worry about that right now. Speak to your baby in your language.
Absolutely. And especially in such an incredibly rich and diverse place like New York City. We don't want people to only speak English. That's what makes New York great and our country amazing, that we have so much diversity in it. I'd love to come back to the results. I would love to hear more of the punchline of the paper that came out a month ago. And if you could walk us through exactly what you found. I'm excited.
So as a reminder, we predicted that the infants of the moms in the high cash gift group would show more fast-paced brain activity than the infants of the moms in the low cash gift group. And that's what we found. So after 1 year of monthly unconditional cash support, we see more high frequency or fast-paced brain activity in the high cash gift group. So to walk you through this slide, on the x-axis, we have frequency or speed of brain activity. So higher numbers mean faster paced brain activity. The y-axis represents the amount of brain activity at those different speeds. The light gray line represents the low cash gift group, and the black line represents the high cash gift group. So what you see is that at the lowest frequencies, you're seeing a little bit more activity in the low cash gift group compared to the high cash gift group. That's not a difference that we would call statistically significant or reliable. We can't be sure that that's not different from chance. But then you see this crossover and this really consistent difference, right? Where at every speed of brain activity, every frequency of brain activity, the high cash gift group is showing more brain activity at those faster speeds compared to the low cash gift group. And when we analyze this, we don't typically analyze it at every frequency, every point. We analyze it in what we call bands of frequency, which you can kind of think of. They literally use Greek letters, unfortunately, so this is literally in Greek. But we think of it as very high frequency, middle, and low frequency. And so when we look at high frequency or beta, or very high frequency or gamma, you can see clear differences between the two groups. So here, to orient you, again, we're talking about the average across the two groups, with the high cash gift group on the left, the low cash gift group on the right. If you imagine the back of the brain is toward the bottom, the top that would be represented by that little nose picture there, the ears are on the side. So you can imagine someone lying on their back with their feet pointed into the screen. That's the view you're seeing. And warmer colors mean more brain activity at that speed, at that frequency. And so you can pretty clearly see visually that the high cash gift group is showing more beta or fast-paced brain activity compared to the low cash gift group. as well as more gamma or very high-paced brain activity compared to the low cash gift group. And moreover, you can see that that's not uniform across the entire brain. There are certain brain regions that seem to be driving those differences, okay? So when we looked across the whole brain, we saw differences, but those differences did not always survive what we call adjustment for multiple comparisons. So largely because we had fewer participants than we expected, we couldn't be completely sure that those differences weren't the result of chance. But when we look at the specific regions, we can see that those differences are driven by frontal and central regions of the brain. And that's really important because those are the regions that support higher order cognitive skills. So from a theoretical perspective, that makes sense, right? Those are the regions we would expect to see these differences in. And from a statistical perspective, those differences remain significant even when we adjust for multiple comparisons. So because of this, we concluded that the weight of the evidence really supported this idea that the infants of the moms in the high cash gift group showed more faster paced brain activity compared to the infants of the moms in the low cash gift group. Now, so it wasn't airtight. Like I said, we had fewer participants than we anticipated. So some of the analyses, while they were all consistent with hypotheses, we couldn't be sure they weren't the result of chance. But this brain regional difference showing that these differences are really centered on parts of the brain that support higher order cognition make us more confident that these are real findings and not ones that are just spurious or by chance.
Wow. I'm so struck by this. I know you said earlier that it's difficult to disentangle exactly like why or the mechanisms behind this. But if you could give us like an educated hypothesis as to really, why that high cash group, had those very remarkable differences in those areas of the brain, what would you put your money on?
Yeah. So we're working really hard on trying to unpack exactly that right now. So we're looking, for example, at the ways that moms are spending the money. Are they spending it on things like books and toys? Are they interacting with their children differently in ways that may be promoting brain development and ultimately behavior? So lots more papers in the pipeline that'll be coming out over the course of the next year or two, where we'll be really digging into some of those questions. And I'll also note that this isn't our last chance to measure brain activity, thankfully, especially since the pandemic limited our ability to really get a clear picture at age 1. So we are currently very actively planning the next wave of data collection, which will be around the children's 4th birthdays, when we'll be inviting the families into our university research settings to once again be able to measure children's development in person. So we'll get a second chance to measure brain activity, and even more importantly, we'll actually be able to directly measure cognitive and behavioral development in the kids, right? So that's very difficult in 12-month-olds. You can think of lots of reasons why kids might be cranky or otherwise unwilling to participate with a stranger when they're just 1. But at 4, it's much easier to actually be able to get a more reliable assessments of development directly. And so certainly brain differences are important. They can tell us a lot, but we're really very interested in trying to understand to what extent does monthly unconditional cash support directly change children's behavior.
Wow. And do you expect to see any changes in brain activity over time? And then I know the behaviors one is a little more difficult given the observation period you have, but do you expect to see significant differences from year to year?
Potentially, right? So as one of my co-authors and colleagues, Dr. Sarah Halpern-Meekin, has suggested, in many ways, looking at the difference after just 1 year is like trying to understand the impact of a college education after just freshman year, right? So it might be
Mhm.
informative, but it may not give us anything close to the whole picture. So we've gotten our first glimpse after just 1 year of economic support. Now we'll be able to look at a much longer term investment in families and see what is the impact on children after 4 years.
And so what other work do you expect is going to come out of baby's first years? I know you said you're working on various things, but what's the next paper? What's the next study that we can expect and when?
So we've got a bunch in the pipeline. As I mentioned, we're looking at expenditures. So, how families are spending the money, the child-focused expenditures. We're looking at parents' reports of time use, especially time with their children. We're looking at impacts on employment. We have a paper likely to come out very soon looking at one of the things I alluded to before, so spending on temptation goods. We have papers looking at family stress. And so all of that is really focused on even just the first wave of data collection at age 1. We're still working on analyzing the age 2 data. We're in the field collecting age 3 right now, and very actively gearing up for age 4 when we'll be able to actually interact with the families in person again. So lots to come for baby's first year.
Lots. And how long do you expect the study to go? Are they gonna be 20 years old
I hope
and the
so.
study will be over, or how long do you anticipate?
No, it's very much our hope to be able to follow up with these kids long term because, it's certainly our hypothesis that an early investment in children is going to reap long-term rewards. And so the current plan, we've got funding for the cash gifts through just past the 4th birthday. We're raising funds for an additional 2 years to try to get to the start of formal schooling, so till just past children's 6th birthday. And we're also raising funds to continue to follow the families. I wish we could raise funds for 20 years. Grant cycles tend to work in 5-year cycles. So we're planning for the next 5 years or so beyond the age 4 birthday. But absolutely, it's our hope that we'll be able to measure much longer term outcomes than just, early literacy and math skills early in childhood, because obviously child development doesn't stop at age 4. And we're hoping to be able to really have a better understanding of the real world impact of early childhood investments.
This is so exciting. I can't wait to see what else is to come from this study and just your work in general. I feel so honored that you let me rapid fire questions to you. I wonder if we only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to make sure if there's anything that, I didn't ask you or you wanted to leave the audience with, that we had a few minutes to allow you to give us your last parting gift, if you will.
Definitely. I think the most important thing is just that we are so incredibly grateful to the mothers and children who are participating in our study for letting us into their lives and letting us and the world learn from them and their experiences. We know it's really, really difficult to be economically struggling. And, we are so incredibly grateful for the chance to be able to do this and to be able to tell the world about what happens when we're able to help support families in a small way.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Noble, thank you so much for your time. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the study, and thank you for joining our audience today. And goodbye.